Grandma, why do we celebrate Christmas? Well, it was Jesus' birthday, and some people believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Do you believe that? Well, I believe that Jesus was a good person and had some great wisdom about how to live, but I don't believe Jesus was the Son of God. So why do we celebrate Christmas? Well, in the face of these innocent inquiries from my daughter, I can see that apart from getting together with family, the celebrations of Christmas and Easter are hollow and hypocritical. They hold no deeper meaning for me than if we'd been opening a sausage factory. I thrash around a bit more in the soup of celebratory parental hypocrisy, and not for the first time. I try to convey to my child that integrity is important, and yet we also live lies. But my conscience is pricked by her questions. I feel compelled to see where I can find congruity, how I can align more closely my values and my actions. And so, following footsteps worn smooth over the ages, I start searching for ways to create holidays and rituals that are meaningful to me, so I can look my children in the eye and share a deeper understanding of life through stories, rituals, and celebrations. Welcome to Tied to the Moon, coming to you on this, the first new moon after the autumn equinox. The new moon appeared at 6:38 on the 1st of May. My name is Kate Lawrence and I am your host. The 1st of May in pagan traditions is one of the so-called cross-quarter days, along with February the 1st, August the 1st and November the 1st. It's celebrated as the halfway mark between the autumn equinox and the solstice, which is a little strange because May the 1st and all of those other dates are not actually halfway between the equinox and the solstice. And by using a calendar date, these days stand in contrast to the equinoxes and the solstices, which are honoured as the physical event actually happens in the Earth's cycle around the sun, not according to the Gregorian calendar on the first day of a month. Maybe the pagans were having a bet each way. In the Northern Hemisphere, pagan celebrations for the 1st of May, or May Day, are associated with the rites of spring, dancing around a maypole, courtship rituals. The corresponding day here in the Southern Hemisphere would be November the 1st, which is associated with Halloween, and the idea that the veil between the worlds is thinner. Like many pagan days, the celebration of Halloween was subsumed by the Christian Church. November the 1st is All Saints' Day in the Christian calendar and celebrates the saints, and November the 2nd is All Souls' Day to honour the dead. In the ancient Celtic tradition, the day is called Samhain and marks the end of the harvest period, the end of the lighter half of the year and the descent into winter and darkness. And there would be heaps of feasting on the harvest foods and great revelry at this time. It was also a time for organising and settling business matters, debts would be repaid, trials for serious crimes would be conducted, and justice was meted out. Importantly, Samhain marked the end of one year and the beginning of the next. It represented a time of transition, a time without time, and so the human realm was no longer bound by the rules of the physical world. Family ancestors would be invited home and they would be honoured, and steps would be taken for harmful spirits to be warded off. In some ways, it seems a reflection of our death-denying and defying culture, that Halloween is now an absurd, ghoulish and sickeningly sweet children's festival. Our terror, unwillingness, inability to look death in the eye, to honour and accept it as the greatest mystery and greatest inevitability of life, leads us to make a mockery of it. This is not necessarily our fault, but in our modern culture, death is rendered invisible. Only a few generations ago, we would have seen many people die in our lifetime. We would have had them die in our homes, we would have been involved in preparing bodies for burial, and we would be deeply connected to the physicality of death and, by extension, to ponder its mysteries. There are ancient cross-cultural practices for contemplating death to remember that we will die in order that we might live well. Buddhists are advised to meditate in cemeteries and next to dead bodies and remind themselves that this too is the fate of their body. Christians have a practice known as Memento Mori, where a person is encouraged to have a physical article related to death, a memento, such as a small skull, and to keep it in close proximity as a reminder. I've added some links in the show notes if you want to explore some of these ideas further. In my searching to find integrity with my children and our celebratory rituals, I read a book which wisely suggested taking a leaf out of the Christian approach and adopting and adapting what already is in existence. Don't try to paddle upstream and invent something new, but work with the flow of what's here. In Australia, at this time of year, we have Anzac Day, a national holiday on the 25th of April to commemorate World War I and the battle at Gallipoli. And I could see a path from that day to a more expansive day that would honour and celebrate the ancestors and the dead. So I plotted and planned and dragged my mother and sister into some Death Day rituals one Anzac Day when my children were small. We did apple bobbing in buckets of water, we did some tree planting, and we named and honoured the ancestors. And I drew my mother out to tell stories of her childhood and her parents and grandparents, and I found children's books about death and dying to read to my kids. My mum and my sister were absolute troopers going along with it all, but they took their role a little too literally, as both of them felt this overwhelming pull in our celebrations to name and honour and remember the Anzac Day Connections. Initially, I was resentful. I have a complex mix of thoughts and feelings about commemorating war. And my vision for the day was to contemplate death and to honour the ancestors more broadly, not war and a very specific subset of ancestors. Then I reminded myself to let go and go with the flow with what was here and allow my mother and sister to find whatever was meaningful for them. But the next year, when it happened again and their focus on the Anzac aspect increased so that it was really all they talked about, I swung back to resistance and resentment. This was not what I was wanting or trying to do, and I couldn't seem to get them to understand my deeper purpose. So the year after, we stayed home and I kept the rituals within my immediate family. We went to the local cemetery instead, I made rock cakes, and we left little pieces of them at random graves. Yes, really. And we did this for a couple of years, but I felt so self-conscious. It felt contrived and a bit stilted. I'm sure this is just from a lack of familiarity. We need to practice rhythms and rituals for them to become comfortable. But I also know it's very difficult to create a tradition in a vacuum, alone, without community and reminders, without others to take up the yoke when commitment slides. So eventually, this event, such as it was in our calendar, just slipped away. But I still do cherish the idea and feel a call to set aside a day to honour the ancestors and contemplate the idea of death which will come to all of us. I imagine a communal day that invites us to remember our ancestors and those recently gone, reminds us of death, and allows for a sort of collective grieving. Maybe that's too much for one day to hold. Perhaps I need a practice of remembering death that is more frequent. And indeed, at various times over the years, I have contemplated more deeply and regularly my own death. So, dear listener, what practices have you explored, if any? What rituals do you observe? What would you like to be inspired to bring into your life? Tied to the Moon has a Facebook page, and I've now created a private Facebook group. And I would love it if you would join and we could start a conversation about any and all of these ideas for life and death. So, to be perfectly frank, until I had children of my own, I had only a vague and passing interest in my ancestors, my family history. But as I looked at my two small children and saw the next generation stretching into the future, I came to ponder the line behind me, my forebears. And around this time, I was helping my cousin on my father's side organise an extended family reunion, and I began to dig around and follow threads of connection to my dad's family. And I was astounded to find that most of it played out within a stone's throw of where I grew up in Moonee Ponds. I was surprised because my dad grew up in the eastern suburbs and he was the only one in his family to come back to these sort of ancestral lands, and he hadn't told us much about any of it. As I followed the trails that went further and further back, I found a young woman, my great-grandmother, whose father was a minister of the Baptist Church in Newmarket, a couple of suburbs over from Moonee Ponds, in the late 19th century. So one day I went for a drive and I found the unassuming church tucked away in an ordinary suburban street of Newmarket, shaded by the broad leaves of the plane trees that lined the street. And I sat in my car under one of those trees, looking across the road to the church, and I imagined her walking along the street. I imagined her standing on the steps of the church. I imagined her furtively farting under her petticoats as she spoke with a parishioner. And I was suddenly struck by a strange sense of ownership. She was mine, she was my ancestor, and could not be other. And conversely, I belonged to her, and she could not change that either. It was as if while I was bobbing around in the sea of life, not knowing which way to go, all along there was a literal lifeline, a thread of connection that said I belonged no matter what. And with her, there were none of the struggles, complexity and frustrations that can dog my relationships with my living relatives. Just this unconditional connection and belonging that feels like an immutable wholeness, a longed-for, accepted place in the world. Thanks for listening to Tied to the Moon. If you like this podcast, please rate and review it on iTunes or wherever you listen. and tell other people about it. And if you have any ideas, suggestions, requests, comments or feedback, I would love to hear from you. You can find the show notes and contact details at storyground.com.au. Theme music for this podcast is by Danya from Audio Jungle. This podcast is a production of Storyground and me, Kate Lawrence, and it's made on the traditional lands of the Gunung Willumbullock at the foot of Mount Macedon, 65 kilometres northwest of Melbourne, Australia.